I'm with the network 18 to 30. I was able to go with NCW this year to the UN Commission on Status of Women. And my focus was like online safety. And I attended a lot of events about technology facilitated gender-based violence and kind of extreme pornography and kind of regulation that they're doing worldwide or the lack thereof. I'm really interested in kind of listening to this conversation and like learning more about it.
Mm-hmm. You also sit on our media group.
Oh yeah, that is yeah. So we look at the website and the social media newsletter as well. Yeah.
So that might be useful then if for when we want to promote something about coming from Harriet, make sure that gets into the newsletters for us. So Harriet, do you just want to give us a very quick brief down, and then like I say, we can decide if there's something we can do immediately, or we can reconvene when we can get more people together.
Sure. So I suppose it might help to start where we've come from as an institute. So we were funded largely under VAW funding, and that has been the main body of our work to look at strangulation, of course, in particular in the context of domestic abuse and sexual violence primarily. And that continues to be a large focus of what we do. Through conversations and through increasing awareness of strangulation across other contexts, we're also asked about other topics. I suppose another context that we haven't necessarily looked at in detail as of yet is contact sports and mixed martial arts as an example of where we're also seeing the act of strangulation being used, and wanted to work to address and provide information where we can and where relevant to do so. But of course, a large area of work that we were started being asked questions around was the topic of strangulation during sex. So we are a research-based institute. Research is pretty much entirely what we do. Through research and what we know from existing research and evidence base, we provide and create and provide resources, but we do a lot of research of our own as well. So that's our position and sort of where we speak from, I suppose. We're a very small institute, I should have said in my introduction. There's 6 of us, and not many of us are full time. So there's a lot of work that we do from quite a small team, I think. But we do what we can, and that includes a medical director who speaks to a lot of the, as you can imagine, the clinical impacts and outcomes of strangulation, again, across contexts. So from a strangulation during sex perspective, we recognise that there was international research on this topic, some of which goes back quite many years, actually, particularly in the US. And we recognise that there wasn't the same level of existing evidence base within the UK with regard to what we know about this topic and how it affects and impacts on individuals here. Of course, we can extrapolate from what we know from the States, and more recently from Australia. They've been doing some brilliant research on this topic as well, any of which I can share if anyone's interested. There was one survey that was conducted by BBC 5 Live in 2019, which looked at, I suppose, categorised them as sort of violent sexual behaviours. So it included choking, quote unquote, that was the terminology that they used. We use strangulation as kind of the correct term, but recognise lots of people use choking. So kind of use both, even though we recognise technically only one is correct. So they use the term choking, but they also looked at other behaviours like slapping and hitting and hair pulling, biting, I think was on there as well. So it gave a bit of a sense of what was happening and gave a rough indication maybe of prevalence. But we wanted to focus obviously specifically on the topic of strangulation. So in October of last year, 2024, we ran a pilot survey, and we worked with a survey platform called Savanta, who BBC 5 Live actually worked with in 2019. And for those of you who kind of haven't worked with survey platforms before or not sure on how they work, they have panelists who sign up to the platform to complete surveys for them, and they get paid for doing so. So those surveys can be anything from kind of consumer research to I did psychology in my undergrad, and I was working with a lecturer who was using these kind of platforms to do psychological research, and it's all informed, and people are provided with all the information that they need. They're given topics on what surveys are coming up and what they can engage with, and as long as they meet the eligibility criteria and they consent to participate in that survey, they are welcome to do so. So that's how our pilot survey went out. And we call it a pilot because it was quite small in terms of the scope, but we still surveyed over 2,000 participants. So we asked a total of 4 or maximum of 4 questions. First question was about individuals' experience of having been strangled by somebody else during sex. I can go into language a little bit more if interested, but that's sort of roughly how we worded it. If somebody said yes, it had happened, and they had an option to say yes, it's happened once, or yes, it's happened more than once, so we got a rough indication of sort of frequency. If they sort of answered to the affirmative, they were then taken to the second part of question 1, which was asking them, of those occasions on which you've been strangled by someone else, were these agreed to in advance? So we didn't use the word consent because individuals' interpretations of that word might be different. So that's why we used kind of the term around agreed to in advance. We just wanted to know whether they agreed to those strangulations or that strangulation happening. And again, they had sort of frequency style options to respond to. So they could say, yes, it's always been agreed to in advance. So that could be it happened once and it was agreed to in advance, or it's happened multiple times and it was always agreed to in advance. They could say sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. So if it was on multiple occasions, some instances were agreed to, some instances weren't. They could say no. So either that one time it happened, no, or all of those times it happened, it wasn't agreed to in advance, or that they weren't sure, or they preferred not to say. Then the other 2 questions, the same, but on the other side of that coin, I suppose. So asking the respondents to say whether they'd ever strangled someone else during sex. And then if it was yes once or yes more than once, they were then taken to the agreed in advance question. So what we found from that is we got a rough indication of prevalence and how that was split across age group of respondents. So we surveyed age 16 plus. Some of the international research is only focused on 18 plus, or 18 to 35 is sort of a subcategory of that. So being able to sample from 16 has been quite interesting, and I think it will be quite helpful. What we found, sorry, I'm just going to consult my notes just so I don't get it wrong, but what we found was 35% of 16 to 34-year-olds had reported being strangled during sex. That was compared to 16% of 35 to 54-year-olds, so that slightly older age group, and 3% of 55 years plus, so the oldest age group. So it's been sort of split into 3 age groups, and it was 35%, 16%, 3%. So you can see sort of the peak and then the drop off in experience of having been strangled during sex. On the other side of that coin, of those individuals who had strangled someone else during sex, 27% of that younger age group, 16 to 34-year-olds, had said that they'd strangled someone else during sex. That was compared to 13% of that middle age group, the 35 to 54-year-olds, and 2% of those aged 55 and above. So again, you can see the 27%, 13%, 2%. Again, you can see the drop off. We acknowledge that there'll be some social desirability in how individuals might have been responding to this survey. So those that had an experience, whether that's being strangled or strangling someone else, may not have said or kind of admitted to it or reported that on our survey for whatever reason. That might be showing up more on those who had strangled someone else. That could explain some of the reason why we've got a slightly lower proportion in that group. We also know we haven't sort of match sampled, so we haven't got stranglers and those that have been strangled within the same group necessarily. So that's also why there might be a difference. What was particularly interesting, that's interesting in itself, but then what's particularly interesting around the agreement in advance questions, there again was a difference. So of those who had been strangled themselves, 50% said that it was always agreed to in advance. That means 50% were saying that either it sometimes was and sometimes wasn't, or it wasn't, or they didn't know. So we've only got 50% of those individuals saying it's always been agreed to in advance. What was interesting is that of those individuals who'd strangled someone else, 57% said it was always agreed to in advance. So we have a higher proportion of those strangling someone else that are perceiving or genuinely believing that has been agreed to in advance. But there's a discrepancy there, which again could be due to social desirability. It could be due to perceptions of individuals, and somebody who's been strangled might be thinking, I absolutely didn't agree to that, and I didn't want that in advance, or didn't agree to that in advance, or didn't want that. And the person doing the strangling believing that they did, or they wanted it, or just thought that that was something that they could do. So there's a lot to kind of unpick there. And I'll stop rambling in a minute. If there's any questions, please do come in. But I suppose what to say from this is that we are launching a larger scale survey, hopefully within the next month or two, which is going to unpick quite a few of these points in greater detail. So it's going to be focused, it's going to be a total of 30 questions instead of 4. And we're going to be asking questions around 4 themes, which will be prevalent. So again, we want to kind of get an idea of how this is happening, how frequently this is happening. Examples like the first age, the earliest age, or what was the first time, how old were you when the first time that you were strangled, or you strangled someone else, for example. So we've got prevalence, we've got consent broadly. Again, we're going to be careful around the wording that we use to try and capture as many people as possible, and kind of so they understand the wording of it as best we can. We've got influences and motivations. So why is it that people who do this do it? Why is it that people who don't do this don't do it? Because we want to understand, and we want to survey across all of those individuals. And then outcomes. So what has happened as a result of being strangled during sex? What do people think happens? Do people think that there is a way of doing this safely? So we know what we can respond to, so we know what perceptions people are holding, and not making assumptions about any of that. And for that survey, we are surveying age 16 to 34, so that younger age group where we know there's the higher prevalence. So, and we're also surveying up to 4,000 respondents. So we're imagining somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 of those respondents will have had some experience of strangulation, either strangling someone else or being strangled themselves. So within that, we should be able to do a lot more unpicking and comparisons across groups within those respondents. So the plan for that is to work, well, we are working with Savanta again, so they're going to be going out to their panelists. So it's not going to be sort of a survey that we're going to need to necessarily recruit to, which is really helpful. And we're hoping it will be sort of early autumn, late summer, early autumn. We're hoping we'll be able to share at least an overview of sort of interim findings. So that's where we're at. Yeah, Gail.
I was going to ask you, will you be going back to some of the 2,000 who answered the first survey, or is this a completely new 4,000 people?
So quite possibly, yes, like they could be still within the respondent group, as long as they meet that eligibility criteria for age. Savanta are also sort of quota sampling so that it's UK nationally representative. So it could be that there are already too many women who have completed the survey, so they're going to be quota sampling to ensure that it's representative of men and women, for example.
Are the people doing this self-selecting in effect? So it's not a completely randomized sample.
No, that's one of the limitations, that the chance that there is a possibility that it will be sent to anyone who is eligible under that kind of quota sampling of being able to get people from this particular region, of this particular demographic. It will be sent to anyone and everyone, but there's a very high chance that individuals who identify with the subject matter are going to be more likely to respond to the survey, of course. Yeah, definitely. Ruth, yeah.
Is there any, if any of our young women wanted to join the survey, or you survey, we can send it out to our group, is that possible?
So it's not available outside of the Savanta platform. So somebody could sign up to Savanta and become a panelist, absolutely. And I imagine if they were to do that in the next few weeks, there's a chance that they would be sent the survey when it's launched. But that it's possible because of, again, the quota sampling, that they might not get sent it anyway. But that's currently the only way to complete the survey, which is a limitation, of course, in itself, because who signs up to these platforms? It requires internet access and computer usage and being able to read and converse in English, and, you know, all of these things we're absolutely aware of.
Would you be able to share the link with us, and then we can share it amongst the group if any of them want to sign up?
So we won't have an externally
I mean to sign up to Savanta.
Oh, yeah, I can absolutely find that. Yeah, let me write that down. What I will say as well is kind of we recognise that with any quantitative research where we're giving sort of answer options for people, that people don't necessarily fit neatly within those boxes that we're providing, it makes it a lot easier for analysis. We do have, I think, 4 free text questions within those 30, and I will say it's a maximum of 30 questions, but it's routed depending on how individuals answered the previous questions, so they're kind of given a unique path in a sense. There are 4 free text questions that we will be analysing qualitatively to be able to get people's written responses, but we know that even within that, they are often a lot sparser and usually a lot shorter than you'd get from an interview or a focus group, for example, where you get a lot more kind of richer data. So that's a limitation that we recognise with all quantitative research. And I suppose on that basis, where we currently have a bit of a gap around this, is that more kind of conversational input into people's experiences and perceptions. So I suppose I'm sort of dropping that hint, if that was something that you wanted to work with us on or kind of explore yourselves, that's definitely a gap from our perspective at the moment. So
absolutely, yeah. I mean, we did have a sort of we had an online discussion debate about it, but it was one of the ones that we didn't actually record and put out because obviously it was confidential. So, like, you know, is there the option of a one-to-one for people if they don't want to be part of a group? If we said we could set up something with our group, but if people want to do it confidentially.
Absolutely, yeah. There's, you know, if we work up a project around this, that would definitely be something that I would recommend actually as default, probably, to have individual interviews. And then if people wanted to kind of come along with a friend or whatever, that could be an option. But yeah, as default, probably, I would suggest.
I was interested when you were going on about how you know, the 50% consent and the people saying that it was pre-agreed being higher. You know, I wonder if there's, you know, that's also about pressure, you know, in intimate moments of, you know, if you're suddenly find yourself intimidated, you'll go along with something just because of fear of rape or something becoming more nastier, you know, if it's somebody that you're in a new relationship with.
Definitely. And I think part of that, the kind of key bit of that for some people would have been the in advance bit. I think from international research, people have reflected when they've kind of been doing interviews and focus groups that, okay, it wasn't asked before, but, you know, I didn't mind it. It was fine, but it still wasn't consented to because, you know, you start doing something, you don't have that prior consent. And I think sometimes, you know, women in particular may shrug things off or kind of go, oh, it wasn't that bad, and but it doesn't take away from the fact that it wasn't agreed in advance. It wasn't a discussion between 2 equal partners in that circumstance, and that's a problem.
Harriet, kind of leading on from that, were there any insights from that initial survey that were kind of divided up by gender?
Interestingly, we had less of a gender split than we were expecting and than what we would have expected from international research. So individuals who said they had been strangled, the male and female split was quite similar. Actually, I think there was maybe 1 percentage point difference, which is absolutely not what we were expecting. Perhaps more so what we were expecting, those who had strangled someone else were more likely to be male than female. But again, maybe not as stark a difference as we were expecting. I'll get the link and kind of share the full report with you, but which has got kind of a full gender breakdown, but it was really interesting. We didn't see what we thought we were going to see. So it will be interesting in this next survey whether we pick that up as well, and we'll be able to, because of the larger numbers, be able to do more inferential statistical analysis, looking at significance and significant differences between those groups. We'll be able to break it down a bit further. So that's what we're hoping to explore further.
Yeah, I was interested in the results when you published it. I was surprised that consent had been so high. 50%. That surprised me.
Yeah. And again, even with that wording around agreement in advance rather than consent, people could still, maybe an individual might sort of assume that because they've agreed before, so the last time it happened, maybe that agreement carries over to the next time it happens. And that's their perception of it, and that's what we want to capture. But I wonder whether there's something within that as well, that technically, according to a legal definition of consent, it's not, it hasn't been every single time something has happened, but for that individual, they feel as though that prior agreement kind of carried through. That's one of the questions actually we're going to ask in this survey, about trying to understand people's perceptions of, if somebody wanted this last time, do you assume that they're going to want it again, basically?
Yeah. And the other interesting thing would be to find out whether there are different perceptions between men and women as to how harmful to health it is.
Yeah.
Because one reads that men think it's from pornography, what women want, that it's a normal part of sex and it's what women want. It would be interesting to know whether the men have less understanding of the potential harm than women.
Yeah. And there's some international research actually as well that suggests, it was Australian research, and what they did was they analysed one of the free text questions that they asked, looking for themes around safety and risk, and they found that women were more likely to comment on these particular themes. So it may also be that women just do more of the thinking generally around it, and actually men might not have thought about whether there was any risk. It's just, again, it's just what you do because that's what you see, but actually women are thinking it through. Even those individuals that have done it themselves and want to do it and want to carry on, they've gone through that thought process around what makes it risky, what in theory, makes it safe. As an institute, our position is there is no safe way to strangle, and we're very clear about that, but recognize that there will be individuals that do think and have been told this is a safe way to do it, by media, social media, magazine articles, YouTube videos.
It'd be interesting to see, hopefully it would be nice to think that it will fade out, but it'd be interesting to see if the ones who are younger now, as they get older, whether the resistance to it becomes bigger.
Yeah, definitely. And this, again, from international research, there's suggestion around differences depending on relationship type. So that might also be some of what's playing into younger age groups, perhaps being more likely to be in relationships where it's more likely to be happening. That's not to say it doesn't happen in people who have been, long-term married, etc. But there was an example, I can't remember where it was from. I think this was from Australia as well, where they've been doing qualitative interviews or focus groups, and there was an individual who was, I think, in her 50s, who was recently divorced, and it was when she sort of went back into the dating pool that she became aware of this, because it had happened to her, and it was almost though it was the nature of the relationship and that sexual interaction which had an impact on kind of prevalence as well. So once individuals in that age group maybe are in more longer term married relationships, is that going to have an effect as well on overall prevalence?
Yeah. I was thinking along the lines of, if somebody, if they're in a new relationship and they feel like they have to go along with it, whereas, when women become more confident about their own bodies, they're more likely to say, no, I don't want to do that, just because they're more confident.
Yeah, good point. Anna, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, What is the current like sex education at schools like regarding strangulation? Is
Took
there
the
much
words
on
out
it?
of my mouth, Anna. I was going to ask about
Yeah,
sex
I
education
don't
in
know
schools.
much
Yeah,
about, or is
yeah.
that an
Yeah.
area that you're looking at kind of lobbying to get improved?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a meeting actually last week with a collective of sex educators, and they did just a quick sort of straw poll at the beginning. And I wrote down the responses, and it was asking those educators whether they currently address the topic of strangulation. And this isn't formal research. This isn't sort of to be shared widely. Obviously, you know, please do share within your members. But it was approximately. So the answer options were no, we don't address strangulation at all within our current sex education. Yes, we do, but only reactively. So if it's brought up by somebody within the session, or they could answer yes, we do, and we bring it up proactively. So it's part of the session plans. They plan for it, etc. I think it was just over 90%, 90% said they either didn't do it at all or only did it reactively. I think it was the majority of people were saying they would respond to it reactively. I think that was around 60%. So 35-ish% saying not at all, 5-ish% saying they do it proactively. So the majority in that sort of middle bulk, but only if it's brought up. So we don't know how often it's being brought up by individuals. We see news headlines, but of course they're headlines. They don't necessarily happen all the time of it being discussed in schools. And absolutely, it probably is being discussed in schools amongst pupils. But are they bringing it up with their teachers? Maybe not all the time. So we had a good conversation with those educators about sort of where in the current sex education curriculum it would feel appropriate, and there was a lot of concern from them, rightly so, or kind of fairly so, around the sort of the backlash from talking about it, and them not wanting to introduce this as a topic if it's brand new within those individuals. Completely makes sense. But what we know is that this is probably being introduced to children at an earlier age than people would know or like to think. So if they're seeing this elsewhere, it feels right to be bringing it up. And consent education is obviously an incredibly relevant and important part to bring this in, but they were also talking about kind of just power in relationships as another option. And we acknowledge as well through research that we've seen internationally that some people do respond to this in a pleasurable and positive way. So let's talk also about pleasure. Let's talk about female pleasure and being able to, as you were saying, Ruth, kind of direct that and say what you like and what you like, not what you think that they like or they want you to like. And yeah, that, you know, being able to talk about female pleasure in sex education, I feel like is like a pipe dream at the moment, but that feels like a really important point. I think there's some guidance coming from the government on sex education that some of them were mentioning that sort of holding out a little bit of hope for, but I'm not sure how much it's going to talk to strangulation specifically, if at all. So we're relying on individuals who kind of care about this topic, of which there were a few in that session, thankfully.
It did get mentioned, raised by educators at the select committee hearing on violence against women in educational settings.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there was, I mean, it may just have been one teacher who raised and cited an example of a 12-year-old boy who'd actually managed to kill his 12-year-old girlfriend because he thought it was a completely normal thing to do as part of sex.
Yeah.
And just, you know, misjudged it.
Yeah.
Tragic.
But I think also it goes to the heart of the fact that really sex education in schools needs to be delivered by professionals. Because I don't think teachers would be comfortable about talking about these things, and particularly things like female pleasure. And, you know, I think it's very difficult for teachers.
I think this topic is so tricky. And again, you know, some of people's concerns, we did like a Mentimeter about what people's concerns were, and it was sort of backlash from parents or kind of concern from parents, but also from the media, because, you know, you can see how it could be spun, you know, teachers teaching children how to strangle each other. And of course, that's not what's happening. But I imagine, and they said something to this sort of nature, that similar things happened when they started talking about pornography. You go, gosh, why are you teaching children about pornography? And you go, they already know. You know, that 12-year-old had already seen it somewhere, hadn't they? And if they're getting those messages, where's the counter coming from? But it's so tricky. It's really tricky.
Ella's involved in a charity called Sexpression UK. So that's psychology students at university, and I think there's quite a few. Shame she's not here, she'd know all the details, but there's quite a few universities involved now. So they do peer sex education, and you know, whether that's more sort of open and covering a lot more areas than maybe teachers would cover themselves. But I think a lot of it depends on who they're talking to as well. Because I know she's had some experiences where it's not sort of been received. That the you know, I think it was a boys' school where they just sort of messed around during the entire session. You know, so it's timing as well, isn't it? And environment. Definitely. It would have been better doing it in a different environment in that case.
Yeah,
usually it's well received.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that's a good way of doing it, but it's being prepared for the questions as well, I think, that could arise. I think it's one thing to kind of have the sort of be armed with the material and the content, and this is what the research says, but some of the concerns from the educators that we spoke to as well was about people saying, I do this and I want to do this, but how do I do it safely? And, you know, everything pointing to that there isn't anything that we can say. This isn't we don't have a harm reduction message for this, and I think that's really tricky. But we can't then also, well, then there would be difficulty, I imagine, with just saying, just don't do it. You know, does that work? I don't think so. I'd be interested to see if it does, but yeah.
Do you work much with universities? I know, like, a standard and freshers week, you normally have like a consent workshop, but I don't personally remember it ever being mentioned, which is interesting. That it's obviously such a big issue, but it's kind of
absolutely. So my background is I used to work in a university in a sexual violence support service within a university, and currently doing a PhD on university responses to sexual violence. So universities are very close to my heart, and I can see how the sexual violence response, if it's not including strangulation now, from what we know, it's missing a piece. And like you say as well, kind of thinking about the prevalence of this, the age group of people that we're probably talking about in university, I do think, from what I can see, from, you know, what I still can see from the sector being out of it, I think it is a missing piece. I've submitted a sort of a bit of a report, a blog to Wonky, who are a higher education think tank, and they publish lots of pieces for practitioners within universities, mainly professional services staff within universities. And I'm hoping that's going to be published in the next few weeks, so that we kind of have a bit of a heads up for the new academic year. Just the other thing on the universities front, which is why it's also very timely, some of you might, all of you might already be aware, but the Office for Students, who are the universities regulator in England, are now regulating universities on their responses to sexual misconduct, as they call it, and harassment and hate. So it's now a regulation requirement from the university's regulator to have an appropriate response to sexual misconduct, which means consent training, which means an option or an opportunity even to be talking about strangulation in a way that is regulated in a way that it has never been before in English higher education. So it's an interesting time broadly, but a framework that can be used to take this topic forward as well, which is an important opportunity.
That would be good. I mean, the network members, some of them wrote to the Office for Students and Universities UK, asking them to, well, they have the Office for Students was designing a survey
Yes.
at the time, and Universities UK have a sample survey on their website that universities can use. And the network wrote to them asking them to include a question on non-fatal strangulation.
Yeah.
But Universities UK, I don't think, replied, and the Office for Students did reply, but it was a fairly, I mean, I can't remember exactly what they said, Ruth. I think they said that it would be addressed through other aspects of what they were doing. It would be covered in effect, but not agreeing to include it specifically in
It
their
was
survey.
quite non-committal, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Which is
yes.
a shame. Yeah. And I
So
think
I
that was just before we linked up to you, Harriet.
I think it was. I think you
was,
mentioned it,
Yeah.
But I think that's indicative of how how strangulation can be seen as sort of just another behaviour that could be slotted underneath umbrella terms of sexual violence and domestic abuse. So I think without recognising the specific harms that could be caused. So unfortunately,
I think the letter called on them to, to include it in surveys, but obviously specifically to cover it in their support services. In fact, all aspects of what they did, all their awareness training, their support services. But the very non-committal response, not terribly helpful.
Yeah. And I think a sort of relatively bottom-up-ish approach could be perhaps more effective. We have done training sessions with 2 universities so far, their sexual violence response teams in particular, about this topic and saying, this is why it's important. We go on about the importance of data capture all the time, about being able to extract information. So asking about this in the first place and then being able to extract it so they can see for themselves what's kind of being presented to them and respond accordingly.
I think that was the point that the network members who wrote made. If you don't know what the prevalence is, how can you possibly design your services to prevent it or respond to it? If you need to know how prevalent it is.
Absolutely.
So is there anything that we can do immediately now then, Harriet, to help support your work, or anything that you think would be useful for us to do amongst the network?
I mean, not immediately, unless anyone's got any ideas. I do think, like I said, there's something missing around kind of the conversational aspect of this and better understanding people's perceptions and views on it. If people would be interested in that, definitely happy to explore. I think, again, just from a personal perspective, the university's avenue, like you say, Anna, is relatively unexplored. So if members are kind of active within their universities, the sex education front also, so sexpression, it would be great. I think we might have said this last time, and I kind of, we can follow through on that perhaps now as well. So nothing that immediately comes to mind, but lots of potentials and ideas really. And happy to have more conversations with individuals or kind of groups of individuals as needed.
Yeah, fabulous. So it's been really interesting, Harriet, so thank you so much. Yeah, and we will definitely be keeping in touch with you.
Yeah, still work to do. Yeah,
lots of work to do.
Yeah.